Hey guys, welcome back to another Chat with Coaches live stream. Today we are talking about negotiation tips. But before we do that, end of the year, as we're going to next 2022, wow, it's crazy, right? I mean, 2021 was like yesterday, it feels like. But we want to talk about this because everyone's kind of thinking about next year and their plans for next year and their goals and what they want to do for themselves. And one of the things people talk about a lot about is like, I want to make more money. I want to get a new position, or I want to do better in my job and my position. And so I'm hearing that from a couple of different clients. I've talked to a few of them about negotiation tips around salary, around getting them to the next level. And Naheed, I'm sure you have with some of your clients as well. So we want to talk about some common issues we see and how we can kind of help people to deal with those. So Naheed, what are some things that you see with your clients? So some of the top couple of things that you hear from your clients.
And I just want to add one more thing. This is equally important to business owners because we're also raising rates as we think about the next year, right? I mean, that's one of the things that we do on a regular basis so that our clients understand we have expenses that also continue to grow. So it really is a very broad-ranging subject that applies to a lot of people.
Yep.
Being a mindset coach, the number one thing I tell people is check what's your motivation for this conversation. Are you doing it because you're tying your self-worth to money? Because if that's the case, I can promise you, regardless of what the outcome is, you're not going to feel satisfied in that. As soon as you tie your self-worth or your deservability or anything like that to anything external, it's going to be fleeting. And then all of a sudden, again, you're going to go back into that same feeling of not perhaps feeling very appreciated, for example. So step one is really being careful about your motivation and understand that who you are as a person and the value you bring as a person has nothing to do with the money you make or don't make, for that matter.
That's huge. I mean, and that's really huge. I think salary is one very, very common, or money you make as a business owner either way, is one very common thing people tie themselves to, have their self-worth to externally. But it can be so many different things. And as a general rule, don't tie your internal self-worth to anything external, because you don't have control over that, right? And when you tie that to something else and that thing goes away, or it changes, or it's something, so you get some negative feedback from some external situation, suddenly your self-worth goes into the toilet because of something external you have no control over. Your self-worth is irrespective of anything external. It's all internal. It's all what you believe and who you are. And so that's huge. I appreciate you saying that, Naheed. One thing that I tell folks along the same lines, actually, is as you're talking about your self-worth, whether it's pricing, whether it's your salary, if you're not looking at least a 2 to 3% increase in your prices, you're losing money every year because of inflation. Simple as that. Just by doing nothing, you lose money every year, just by existing. And there's a lot of talk right now, especially around after the post-pandemic, everything going on right now with all the money that's been printed, and how inflation is going to go through the roof, which it most likely will, once we catch up to how much we're actually printing. But once that happens, inflation for the last year or two is not going to be 2 or 3%. It's going to be a lot more than that. And so just on a normal year, you want to be increasing your pricing and or your salary 2 to 3%. If you're not doing that, you're like I said, you're losing money. But now you want to kind of be intentional about saying, okay, you know what? If I'm going to at least make the same as 2 or 3%, but you want to be making more if possible, because every year your skills increase, your ability to do your job increases, your confidence level increases in theory, and just in general, your experience level. You've seen more things, you've seen more scenarios, you've been through a lot more. So your ability to do your work increases. And so you want to be compensated for that. You want to make sure you're compensated for that. And making sure that you raise your prices, raise your salary by at least 3 to 5%. I would say 5 to 7%, honestly, just to make sure you're being fair to yourself and accounting for both inflation and your increase in skill. That's where you want to be at.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very well-reasoned thought. But what happens when you go to talk to somebody, you've got your boss or your client on the flip side of this sitting across from you, either on Zoom or on a table, and the words don't come out, or they don't come out clearly, they don't come out succinctly. And so that's kind of where I like to tell people there are two parts to this conversation. There's the internal part, which we kind of already jumped into with the tying in your self-worth, and then there's the external part, right? And so maybe it would be helpful for us to break this conversation down into those two separate parts.
Yeah.
And with the internal part, it really is about first understanding What's the fear? What's the doubt? What's the insecurity? I had this conversation with somebody. Today's Thursday. Just yesterday on what it would look like. She's a business owner if she was to start increasing her rates. What are the clients that she might potentially lose? But in that process, as we were walking through it and discovering certain things, what she realized is that yes, there are some clients that you may lose. That's sort of the reality of the situation, and it's okay. They got what they needed from you, and you got what you needed from them as well. But she came to the conclusion that she's opening herself up to her bigger and bigger clients that she did not have the space for. She physically did not have the space for. And so it goes back to then what is the internal barriers that we all have, because we tend to overestimate the negative side and we underestimate what could be the good that could potentially come out of it, right?
Yep.
So those are all the internal conversations that you need to have a discussion with yourself or with your coach or whomever before you're doing it with your client or your boss. That's not the time to figure this stuff out.
Absolutely. 1,000%. You got to have this conversation before the conversation has to happen. And another thing that a lot of folks struggle with is the value proposition, right? And in their heads, like, is this worth that much? And they have that struggle of like, oh, I don't know if I could charge that much. Not because the other person doesn't believe they would charge that or pay that much, but because they internally don't believe that they can charge that much, that they're worth that much. And so I always tell folks, it's what you get paid is, look at it not as money, but as compensation, right? Mm-hmm. And that can take many, many forms. So if you're working with a client, for example, and you're saying, hey, this year I've charged $100 an hour, and next year I want to increase to $120 an hour, right? That's great. Some of your clients may be like, oh, I can't pay that or whatever. But in your head, you're having this conversation with them before you even have it with them, and they're saying that they can't pay it in your head. You don't know that they can't pay it until you actually have the conversation with them. But what you can have in your back pocket is saying, look, my rates are going to $120 an hour. See what their response is. If their response is, listen, I really can't afford to pay that, then say, okay, well, I totally understand that. And maybe not. You don't have to part ways with them. You can say, I'd be willing to continue working with you if you could pass referrals to me instead, right? Or like refer one person to me in a month, and we'll keep it at $100 an hour. And that's another way of looking at compensation as a whole package instead of looking at it as just monetary, because that's now new introductions you're getting every month that you wouldn't otherwise have. So don't be afraid to get creative about how you're getting compensated. On the salary side of things, on the worker side of things, you can do something similar, right? We talk about vacation time negotiations or things like bonuses or opportunities like that. As you're talking through everything is negotiation. Everything is negotiable. And it also tells you how much they think you're worth to them, because the company is also going to be on the hook there to be able to say, we're accounting for inflation or not. Because at the end of the day, they need to compensate their people accordingly. And the people that they're charging, the clients that they have, they're probably not going to be keeping them the exact same amount every single year themselves. So I'm not sure about you, but I think that's pretty much most of the time the companies like that end up raising their prices over time anyway.
Right. And I love your idea of being expansive in how you negotiate, because anytime you sit in front of HR and you have a conversation, when you're being hired, they keep telling you, well, you got to look at the whole package. There's a whole compensation package. Don't just focus on that one salary number. And of course, when I was in corporate, what did I focus on? The one salary number. But now that I'm out of corporate, I don't get sick days, I don't get vacation days, I don't get 401, I don't get any of those things. All of a sudden, I'm looking at that, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty valuable, actually. And so there are multiple places where you can negotiate. And again, if you don't tie your self-worth to salary, you will actually be in a stronger position to negotiate, because you will be having a more objective conversation and you can look at all of these other things. Because for us, one thing we've learned in the pandemic is that our time is precious. Our time with our family, or even if you don't like your family, time doing the things that you enjoy doing with maybe friends, it's actually quite precious, more so than 24 hours working, which is what the expectation ends up being when you get paid that much more. So,
and you said very important. You said you get tied to salary. I think that's a great metaphor, is getting tied to it, because when you're not tied to that, you become more free to negotiate and everything else, right? think of it as everything is negotiable, because it really is. If they can't do salary, maybe they can do vacation days. If they can't do vacation days, maybe they can do work from home days. Maybe they can do, some things like that. So just get creative about that. Don't be afraid to have those kind of conversations. If you never ask, the answer is always no. But like Naheed said earlier, have that conversation with your coach or with your mentor or with someone who you can trust, and have that conversation frankly with, and say, understand, because maybe sometimes, I hate to say it, but sometimes what you're asking for may be unreasonable, right? It could honestly be unreasonable. But I would say that's a pretty minority of the situation. More often than not, folks undervalue themselves. And so I want you to make sure that you're taking a chance to look at yourself objectively, look at your compensation objectively, and be honest about what you're able to contribute, what you're able to get back in return.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, as we go from internal to the external stuff, when I was doing my MBA, I had to take a class on being able to do reviews, to do annual reviews and things like that. And one of the things that I really got out of that class, and I used it in my position at that time, is you want to start building data, not 1 week or 2 weeks prior to your this conversation. You build data the day after you have your annual review from the prior year. And that's exactly what I did. It takes a little extra time, but I would write in there all the cases I finished on time or earlier. I would write in there all the cases that were really challenging, and this was the outcome, that the favorable or positive outcome. I used to mentor people at that time. I never really talked about that, so I talked about all the people I mentored and the time I spent doing that. You really need to start building your case right from the beginning, because when you do that and you present something, and I presented it with dates, that this was due on this date and I handed it on this date, was very objective from the perspective of my manager. She didn't have to go back and double and triple checks. Is this right or is this right? Or I didn't make it ambiguous for her to have to figure stuff out. And at that point, it became very clear that, yeah, she may have thought I was doing a decent job, but now on paper, it looks like a pretty good job. And I feel like I'm frozen in there. But the point is, if you can hear me, is that the point is, the work starts from the external standpoint, the doing portion the work starts from the day after your prior annual review.
Yeah, you are frozen, but we can still hear you, thankfully. So that's the important thing. But no, I love that. And I think that's actually, believe it or not, it's actually a internal and external combined, right? Because as you're taking notes on yourself and keeping a journal, keeping a record of the things you're doing well, things you're able to keep doing, and all the great accolades you're doing over the course of the year, you're also subtly reinforcing to yourself your value proposition, right? You're reinforcing to yourself, here's all the amazing things that I've been doing and how I've been doing these things and how well I work and the value I bring to the organization or to my clients for that matter. And so you're able to say, these are the things that I've done on paper, and look at that every so often. I would say do it as often as you can. If you can do it daily, then that's great. But even just at least weekly, do it at least weekly, where you're saying, looking back on the week and saying, on a Friday or a Monday and saying, okay, last week, here's what I accomplished. Here are the things that I did. And here's the value that brings to the organization, to my boss, to my clients, to whoever else that is relevant in terms of being stakeholders in your work. So you want to be able to do those things on a regular basis. And like I said, that reinforces internally the value proposition you have, as well as being able to give you the ammunition to go into that meeting and say, here's all the amazing things that I've done, and here's why I'm asking for this raise, or here's why I'm raising my prices to my clients. So that's a really, really powerful tool in that sense. And I think Naheed's back, but her video's not back yet. But
yeah, it seems like I'm going to be out for the rest of it. But I like what you said, that you're right. It gives you the confidence, because then you too are reminded that, yeah, you know what? I did a really good job. The other thing that I was thinking about that's really important is, don't be tone deaf. What do I mean by that? If you got a company that really was negatively impacted by COVID, and you're coming in and you're asking for a salary increase, well, guess what? It's not going to reflect very well. But there are other things, like you were mentioning, that you can negotiate on, right? As you were saying, pay time off, random days that you may work from home, whatever that happens to be. A lot of people are right now working from home, but whatever the case may be mindful of what's your company and your department's situation, and what other people are also getting as compensation. Doesn't mean that you have to do everything that they're doing, but it gives you an understanding of where your department head's thinking and where they're willing to be able to stretch a little and negotiate a little bit. So just really be careful of what's going on within your company as well. I will say one thing, that especially if you feel like people have been laid off and you've been asked to do more work, it might even be a conversation to say, hey, you know what? I understand we're doing poorly or we didn't do as well because of the pandemic, but I still feel like that all my extra work requires some recognition. What can we talk about? What are the options over here? Like, bring it up. I don't mean you shouldn't shy away from having the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great way to bring it up. Exactly. Is like, what can we do here? Instead of saying, I want a salary increase, because people just got laid off, right? So like that tone deafness really does come into play, especially coming out of the pandemic for the last, 2 years now at this point. Folks are going through situations where they've never, this is not precedented right now. It's completely unprecedented, and companies have not been through this before. Now, some companies obviously have handled it better than others. Some companies have handled it really well, and other companies have handled it really, really poorly. But you don't want to be one of those people who handle it poorly. And so going to the company and saying, listen, I want to acknowledge all the work that I've done here. I want to acknowledge at the same time the work, the difficulty that this company has faced and had to lay off made difficult decisions and lay off people. At the same time, I would be ridiculous if I didn't acknowledge the fact that I've done 3 people's work over the last year or 2 years. And we have to either hire someone or figure something out here in the situation so we can get this back on track. This ship cannot continue to sail this way. And asking them, making it into a collaborative effort, not getting upset, not being like, you need to do this right now, but it's really just kind of brainstorming, saying, hey, what can we do to make this better, right? What can we do to make sure that I'm fairly compensated for my time and effort and energy, and to make sure that this is not a huge burden on the entire team as a whole, whatever's left of that team. I love that a lot. I love that not being tone deaf is huge. The other thing I want to point out is the idea of imposter syndrome, and this is something that comes up a lot, and it ties back to actually everything we talked about so far. And both women and men deal with this in situations like this. And as you're talking about this, if you have that fear of like, am I good enough? Am I good enough to ask for a raise? Am I doing good enough work? A lot of the things we talked about actually will reinforce that, especially that whole keeping track, like Naheed said, keeping track of your accomplishments throughout the whole year, so you can see for yourself the value you brought to the organization. But again, it goes back to the value proposition and the idea of what is your value and what are you tying it to? Whenever you tie that value to some external proposition, whether that's a job title, whether it's a skill set, whether it's anything like that, that's when you start to get those kind of imposter syndrome feelings, and they get stronger because of that. Now, if you're able to tie that back to yourself and say, no, look, what's the value that I actually bring? Who am I personally? And what do I bring to the organization? That's when you can overcome imposter syndrome in that way and say, look, I clearly am delivering value because of all these things that I've listed over the past year or so that I've done. I'm also getting feedback from folks on a regular basis. I'm seeking that feedback from myself and really investing in self-awareness to say that to myself, I am good enough. I know that I'm good enough at what I do. And that can be really, really powerful to delve into that.
Yeah, and I think that the imposter syndrome for some people is so strong. I certainly experienced that. I can tell you for a fact that for me, if I had just tried to talk myself out of it, I don't think that I would have been able to do it. And so if you are in that situation, I strongly urge you to talk to somebody professionally about it, because I promise you, it's it impacts you significantly more than just professionally, because it's a self-worth, it's a confidence, it's a deservability issue. If you pay attention to it, you'll see the fingers of it going into multiple different areas of your life. And if you were to take the future cash flow value of all the times where you have downplayed yourself or not asked for a raise or not gone after that bonus over the life of your career, you would be shocked, really shocked at how much money you're leaving on the table. And so from that perspective, or from any perspective, if that sense of deservability is so strong, or lack thereof is so strong, that is something I would urge you to consider for 2022 as something to be able to really pay attention to. because it doesn't go away. I can promise you, you can take as many certifications, you can do as many graduate degrees. It doesn't go away because, again, you're tying it to something external,
Correct.
and that will never help you.
In fact, it actually hurts more because you tie it to
Yes.
more and more things external.
It makes you feel even more of an imposter.
Yeah, exactly. Running out of time here, so I was close with this one thought. Personally, as a personal experience, when I was hired, my very first job out of law school, second job after law school, actually, I took the salary that I was given. I was like, I tried to negotiate, but I wasn't great at it. So I was like, okay, yeah, I guess I'll take this low salary. That low salary came back to haunt me for every position I had since then. Because at that point, they're like, oh, well, you only made this much at last job. You only made this much at your last job. So then they wanted to give me incremental increases, very, very small ones from then on. And that came out to bite me in the butt big time from that first position. So to Naheed's point, it's a huge one. It's a very, very easily missed thought. But being able to negotiate your salary effectively and being able to do this work on yourself, the self-awareness work, the work on the imposter syndrome to really quiet that imposter, it's really powerful. It cannot be overstated in terms of how valuable that can be in your career, in your life, in your business. So really, if you have not taken time to do that and it's something that's been plaguing you over the last X number of years, please take the time to invest in that. And along the same lines, I'll do a shameless plug before we go. I'm starting a mastermind group in January for business owners and one for coaches. So if you want more information about that, it's going to be really focused on accountability, education, networking, and some real good connections with great vendors and other amazing people going through the same kind of things you're going through. So you can really make a mastermind, a strong group. Please reach out to me. Let me know if you're interested in that group. I'd be happy to share information with that. And Naheed, anything you want to say to close before we jump off here?
Yeah, just one reminder. When you finally sit down and have this conversation, understand it's the beginning, right? Don't be disappointed if you don't get any kind of result or response right away. Understand that it is the beginning of a conversation. And the idea is to, of course, keep it moving forward, but don't necessarily expect that you'll always walk away with an answer right in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's huge. Yeah, coaching is a long-term thing. It's going to take time to get into that business and get into that mindset, and then really let that work on you, because it takes time to absorb. It takes time for your brain to do the work and subconscious, and I think that's huge. Thanks for sharing that, Naheed. So thank you guys all so much for tuning in this whole year. Honestly, for folks who are tuning in with us, this is going to be the last one for 2021. So we'll see you guys in 2022, and we will announce the first dates of that once we have those. But thank you guys again so much for tuning in. If you like this video, hit the like button, hit subscribe, leave a comment. Let us know how you like the videos this year, this one in particular, and what you want to see next year out of us next year. Topics, concepts, questions you might have. We'd be happy to answer any of those and talk through any of those with you guys. Yeah, thank you guys so much. And anything you want to say before we hop off? Sorry.
No, Happy New Year.
Yeah, happy holidays, happy New Year. And yeah, put your best foot forward in 2022. Take care, guys. Stay safe and have a